Welcome back to the Cage Rage podcast. This is Devin. That is Miguel Iterati. And this is a CRP News Roundup for the day of October the 2nd, 2019. We have a big week in the world of mixed martial arts. We got a lot of news that we still haven't hit that came out in the past week that we're going to hit today. But I do want to just start. There's no place other that we can start than the big middleweight title bout this weekend. I do want to just take us through a little bit of a history here. September 28th, 2001, two names, Gil Castillo and Dave Menne. That was the day that the UFC instituted the 185-pound title that Dave Menne won. Went on to go into the hands of Murilo Bustamante, went on into the hands of the late, great Evan Tanner. Then we went into where we really had our first star of the middleweight division, Rich Franklin, who went on to defend the belt a couple times before running into the all-time great Anderson Silva, who had a lock on this division for several years. That lasted all the way until Chris Weidman dethroned him back in 2013. We went on there from there to Luke Rockhold, Michael Bisping, George St. Pierre. And now, really since the Anderson Silva days, there's been a lot of fluctuation in the middleweight division, a lot of inactivity among the champions. Well, flash forward to February earlier this year, we got a matchup that was billed as kind of a turning of the guard matchup between two fighters that have similar styles, the old vet in Anderson Silva and the new star that the UFC is clearly trying to groom in the last style blender, Israel Adesanya. In the background of all this, on that same day, was supposed to be a title fight between Kelvin Gastelum and current middleweight champion Robert Whittaker. That fight falls out day of the fight due to a hernia issue that Robert Whittaker had to be rushed into emergency surgery for. And then they institute a middleweight interim title between Adesanya and Gastelum. A few months later, Adesanya pulls together one of the best wins of the year and one of the best fights of the year. Now flash forward, here it is, October, and we are going to finally get the unification middleweight title bout that's been heavily hyped down under in Australia, Marvel Stadium in front of 60,000 people between Robert Whittaker and Israel Adesanya. Now, I brought that brief history up for a reason, Miguel. Is this the best middleweight title fight since the Anderson Silva days?
Since the thing is when Weidman took out Anderson Silva, there was that feeling that, Weidman, Rockhold, then you start adding some of the other guys like Yoel Romero, Jacare, and stuff, that there was a very high level established in the post-Anderson Silva world. And to be honest with you, I don't know if I would sign this up, although the thing is, to me here, Adesanya, to me, still has questions he has to answer. He's been rushed a little bit, and maybe taken care of a little bit in terms of matchmaking. Gastelum, you're absolutely right. That was a standout fight. But does a win over Gastelum match up on paper to, two wins over Yoel Romero that Whittaker has? I think Whittaker's got the belt. He's the champion. And if he comes back similar to his old style, Adesanya is unpredictable, right? But in many ways, he's also very predictable, right? He ain't going to take me down. He's not coming in to try to submit me, right? So and I think Whittaker is Whittaker said it himself. He said, if Kelvin Gastelum hit him, I'm going to hit him, They call this guy Bobby Knuckles too, So it's like, I don't think he's going to be completely taken out of his game. Now, if he is, and Adesanya is as special as Dana keeps telling us, or John Jones keeps telling us, or whatever, then, maybe we'll see a passing of the torch. But I think Adesanya should carry that burden of proof. I'm going to force him to show me this weekend.
I agree. I think that there's still some, we still need to see him against more high-level talent, on a consistent basis. But I think that he's been doing that. I will take a little bit of issue, though, with the idea that he's been rushed just because I've heard you talking about Vasily Lomachenko over in boxing before, about it's not really heard of to see somebody with that little bit of pro fights being in the position that he's in, even being considered the pound-for-pound best. But it really doesn't tell the story because there's a backdrop behind his pro boxing career of a very proficient and almost 400 amateur fights where he was just magnificent in. He's probably the most decorated amateur boxer in history. Adesanya, in the background of his MMA tenure, has 80 kickboxing fights and 5 professional boxing fights. He's got a incredible combat record. I mean, something like 97-5 when you add in MMA, boxing, and kickboxing. He has got a very proficient striking resume in the backdrop of his MMA career. Robert Whittaker, but you are right that people know what Adesanya's style is going to be. He's gonna look to keep the fight on the feet, be elusive, mix up his striking, and
yeah, but boxing and kickboxing and your pedigree doesn't really necessarily give me any inkling as to a complete game. I know what we got with him already, and I mean, I think you got to take some of that stuff with a grain of salt, because the boxing he did, I think he's 5-1 in his boxing career, and kudos to what he's done in boxing. He even has a win over Brian Minto, who was a heavyweight contender. So, I'm okay with that. But once you get into the world of kickboxing, it gets too murky and too small real fast. And 80 kickboxing fights, I haven't seen them all. Maybe they're all at a high level and maybe they're all worthy, but I'm sure that's just reinforcement for what we know about him already. And that's that he's an elite stand-up attacker. But Whittaker, I don't know that scares Whittaker without some of the other wrinkles and dimensions. And, when you're dealing with Joel Romero coming at you and he brings the wrestling and the heat on top and things like that, and Whittaker's survived that twice, I'm not sure that Whittaker is as worried as people might think he is. Or, I'd be confident if I entered this fight with Whittaker. I decided they should both be confident. Now I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm giving the advantage to Whittaker in this fight, is just my opinion.
Yeah, I can see how people are feeling that way. I sat here last night with my cousin James, and we rewatched some of Whittaker's fights, and he felt that the two closest fights that we could watch that would indicate anything about Adesanya's styles was Whittaker's fight with Uriah Hall and his fight with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Well, Wonderboy Thompson we kind of threw out because that was at welterweight. Whittaker, it was like over 5 years ago. Whittaker was like 24 years old at the time, and he got knocked out in that fight. The Uriah Hall fight was a little bit closer, but I believe it was his middleweight debut. That was a good indication, but it doesn't really – Whittaker's gotten a lot better since then, and Uriah Hall, as good of a technician he is on the feet, he's just a little bit more flat-footed, a little bit more power-heavy than Israel Adesanya, just a little bit different style. So I think that they're both going to be fighting styles that we haven't really have a good indication of what to expect here. The thing that just looking at this from how they've been presented and hyped in the media, I do think that Robert Whittaker has been taking real issue with. He's kind of like the forgotten man here, is the way he's acted in the media. Like, all this hype's on Adesanya, but don't forget about me. I went 50 minutes with Yoel Romero, as you mentioned. I knocked out Jacare. Yeah, I knocked out Jacare Souza. I knocked out Derek Brunson. I'm a legit world-class fighter. Don't forget who I am. Adesanya still has his best win on his resume right now is Kelvin Gastelum. I don't devalue that win as much as some people are, though, because after watching that fight, I was so impressed with Gastelum's fortitude, his chin, his boxing is incredible. And a lesser man would not have stayed in there as long as Gastelum did and made that fight as dirty and made that fight as tough. That's something that I have to ask you, Miguel, is number one. Another thing about Robert Whittaker is this man's a very good wrestler. He doesn't ever show it, but he was even considering joining the Australian national team for the Olympics back in like 2014. A very good wrestler. And Yoel Romero was unable to really do anything in the wrestling department against him. It turned into a straight striking match. Does Whittaker try to mix it up? He mix up his MMA game, mix it up for a more top up and down type of fight on Adesanya. And number two is if he doesn't do that and it turns into a straight striking match, doesn't that play straight into the hands of Adesanya? If he's coming out and yeah, he might be able to hit Adesanya, but is he going to be able to take as much as Gastelum did?
I don't think anybody should discount the Gaston fight for Adesanya. I think it was a standout fight, and I think you could show that, to anybody at any point in history or anything like that as a fight, where both guys gave their all. And Adesanya answered a lot of questions there, but I still have a couple of open questions. I mean, the fact to me here is Whittaker could get knocked out in the first couple of minutes, or Whittaker could, trip him up, get a takedown, and ground and pound him in 3 minutes and not let him up. That would be the short path for both guys to win the fight. If they're starting to mix it up and it goes wrong, Whittaker hopefully feels that he has that wrestling option and can work on top. And that would be one of the things is Adesanya on his back now. Now the striking game becomes completely different. He could still be dangerous. He's so long, and if you get hit with elbows and stuff like that, maybe part of his defense. But we haven't seen any of that from him yet. Is he going to just be a turtle on his back? Is he going to be weaponized the whole way through and make Whittaker pay, or is Whittaker going to get off ground and pound? Can Whittaker ground and pound him out? I think Whittaker can ground and pound him out if it goes that way.
Yeah, I mean, he's shown great top heavy ground and pound before. I mean, he really busted up Jacare when he got on top, and he was doing the same to Derek Brunson. And I mean, he's definitely much better.
Both guys threaten on the ground, right? I mean, Brunson is a threat to reverse on you because he likes the top game and he doesn't like being on his back, and he's a strong, explosive guy. And Jacare, what can you say about Jacare's ground game, right? So he's been in there with guys, Adesanya on his back. I don't think he's as capable as a Brunson of reversing on you, and so what threat could he bring you from that position? If I were Whittaker, I'd look to get him there early. Like you said, bust him up, hurt him, let him know, and even if he gets up out of there, you shouldn't let him up. You get him down, you beat him up, you get the ref to stop it, you do what you got to do. You beat the fuck out of him, for lack of a better word. But you shouldn't let him up. If you let him up, that's almost one of the things about Adesanya. It's like, okay, he survived a wicked ground and pound, and now you've got him standing again. So a lot is going to go into that first exchange in that first round of who dictates.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that there's going to be a very quick clash in this fight. I think that Whittaker's going to know he can't get walked down by Adesanya. I think he's going to really – and there's kind of a range difference with Whittaker and what I see with Gastelum. Gastelum's more wants to plod forward, parry the hands, get into like a middle boxing range, and find his shots that way. Whittaker likes to kind of blitz in with long jabs, long right hands, tight uppercuts on the inside, and he's got much more of he's got faster feet than Gastelum. He's got faster hands than Gastelum. So I do think that the shots are going to be coming faster, and I think he's got more power than Gastelum does too. But at the same time, him opening up to really try to crack Adesanya could just play straight into Adesanya's hands. Let me talk to you a little bit about Oceania's history. I mean, they're saying that this is the biggest fight in Oceania history, and what does this do for the star power of both these guys? Because I'll tell you what this is really reminiscent of me for. And Whittaker hasn't been around as long as Jose Aldo, but it reminds me a lot of the Jose Aldo-Conor McGregor fight because there's been so much hype on Adesanya. He's had this quick build-up, this quick, fast rise to fame. And if there was one thing about Jose Aldo is he was a great long champion, but he wasn't really exactly the big crossover star that somebody like the challenger like McGregor was going in there. And I remember the lead up to that fight, like this is Aldo's opportunity to really cement himself and his legacy and make himself a star by beating the face. I see this even more with Robert Whittaker. Whittaker's younger. He hasn't been a champion near as long. As I mentioned, he's already kind of feeling like he's the forgotten man here. Going down there to Australia where they're going to pack this stadium show, and the UFC has definitely been putting a lot of money and a lot of hype behind Adesanya. I do feel like this is a pivotal fight for both fighters because You got Adesanya, who's really trying to live up to the hype, but you got Whitaker, who could actually make himself that big star by beating the hype train in this, and also be a big star in his hometown where they can make massive stadium shows. So, I mean, let's talk a little bit about their star power, the market down there in Oceania and Australia and stuff. What does this do for both of their stocks in this fight? How pivotal is this moving forward? If Whitaker gets destroyed in this fight, does he even get another? I mean, is he ever going to possibly get another opportunity to fight in his hometown, in his home country, in a stadium in this big of an opportunity? I mean, this is a big chance for Robert Whitaker, who's kind of not really the most media friendly guy, hasn't really garnered the kind of attention that the challenger has. So I threw a lot out there, but just take the floor from there, Miguel.
Well, I mean, if you just look at the facts and figures, the last time we saw Whitaker was in, I believe, June of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen Adesanya 4 times since then, in that same time frame. So he's popped up, including the Gastelum fight, including, his rise and showcase. He's come with, John Jones saying that he's the guy he's worried about, that, he's got, that stuff is all premeditated. So this was a push and a fast rise for Adesanya, where we got, heaping platefuls of them. 4 fights since the last time we saw Whitaker. So Whitaker can't escape that feeling of being the forgotten guy. And I hope he carries that better than Aldo did, because Aldo, ran in against the precise guy and just made a mistake and gave the guy exactly what he wanted. And you're right, that formula could work for Adesanya too. If Whitaker goes in there all crazy, we could be one punch away.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good illustration, because Aldo did just very visibly buckle under the pressure of the moment. And
in everything, for the press conferences and everything, McGregor dominated him. He'd won that fight before the fight entered. The kid, I don't know what you call his charge in the beginning of that fight, but it's not what they practiced. I can almost guarantee you that.
Very emotional. And I do think that when we are looking, if Adesanya goes in here and he gets his best performance to date, he in this audience, in this type of platform, in this type of moment, he's going to become one of the biggest stars in the sport. And with his personality and his type, the way the UFC's already mentioned him, and you already brought up John Jones, I think we are looking at another division that's going to kind of have like that Conor McGregor effect, or the Khabib Nurmagomedov effect, where it's not going to be just so black and white about who the next opponent's going to be. We got people like Jared Cannonier and Paulo Costa and Yoel Romero still floating around out there. But as you mentioned, they're already talking about super fights at Raider Stadium in 2021 with John Jones. They're talking about – I've seen them John Jones comment on one of the Instagram pics of Adesanya and mentioned, let's do this in Africa. Let's fight in Africa. Like, they're talking about like a new Rumble in the Jungle in the future if they can keep winning and dominating like this big. Obviously, the UFC's already seen a potential Adesanya undefeated middleweight champion. John Jones not really having anybody up there, and they're already like trying to discuss when would be the right time to make a big super fight. And I was talking to David Love, who we both know, and he was like, "Man, if they're going to end up doing that, they're going to do that quick, because John Jones is not going to want Adesanya to get older, bigger, better." And while he goes on the downhill before they try to do that, he's going to want to get that out of the way early. So I think that, it might be better for the division if Whitaker wins. If Whitaker wins this, I think they go straight to either Costa or Cannonier. And I think it kind of hurts Yoel Romero of ever possibly getting another. I think Adesanya winning really helps Romero being somebody that's going to be looked at as a front contender. But Adesanya winning could end up being another division that has a champion that, like I said, it's not going to be so black and white who he's going to fight next.
I don't know. What do you want me to say? The bottom line to me is this: if you're Adesanya, grab as much money as you can. So I'm okay with that. And the bottom line is to me, I do think that the appeal of being of Nigerian descent and doing a show in Nigeria, that economy could probably support it. And as you see, in boxing and things like Rumble in the Jungle and things, there is a precedent for creating the atmosphere for a fight that gets everybody on the planet's attention. And that's what the UFC's after. That's what, and I'm okay with Adesanya. I'm not typically a pessimist. And I hope that people in Australia and all the way across the board carry their end of things correctly here. Because at the end of the day, Adesanya is an immigrant there, and that can be a controversial topic and stuff like that. And the UFC is sort of counting on, him being embraced completely by the Oceania market. And I hope that that's the case, and I hope people can overcome petty, stupid, problems in the world here when you're in the in world-class sport and appreciate what you have. You have a guy who can possibly cross over and have appeal in Australia, right? And in the United States, obviously, as a UFC champion. And then in Nigeria, which would be a new market for MMA and stuff like that. How can you not, wish him success?
All right.
But you can't contrive that success. In the UFC, talking about, super fights with John Jones and stuff like that. That to me is an acceleration, a little bit of a disrespect to Whitaker. They shouldn't be taking it to that level. And the bottom line to me is that passing of the torch fight with Anderson Silva and Adesanya, you watch that fight beginning to end, completion, the whole thing. Yeah, you can maybe, get some clips of it that are highlights and stuff, but that's not a highlight reel fight. That's not a fight that I can extrapolate as to what seemed to be going on. You never know and stuff like that, but it seemed to be a situation where Adesanya was fighting a guy he respected, and he didn't start the fight until the other guy kind of said, "Hey, aren't we in a fight?" and kind of came at him a little bit. But that was going to be a black eye for Adesanya unless Anderson Silva stepped up. That's just my take on it. The point is again, when it comes down to pedigree, that fight he gets credit for. I'm not sure it was a pedigree high octane highlight reel performance for Adesanya. So, I get back to that, and he still has a lot of questions, including pressure and things like that. What's going to happen here if unfortunately, hopefully things don't get ugly. But there have been mass shootings and racially motivated shootings and immigration types of problems in Australia, not on the scale of the States and stuff like that. But like I said, I hope it doesn't get ugly, but our world is so ugly nowadays, and I wanted to bring it up because hopefully in sport we transcend that, and that becomes the beginning. Because you're Australian, white, black, the natives from there. I don't want to get the label incorrect, but every one of them should back this kid. There's no reason not to, and I just hope it doesn't get stupid. I hope I didn't bring up a subject that we're talking about sadly later.
Yeah, I don't have any indication that would happen, but I hope it doesn't. But nevertheless, this weekend a lot of legacy, a lot of star power is on the line in this gigantic main event, and they're going to have plenty of an audience to do it. That stadium is amazing, and there's going to be kangaroos. There's going to be all sorts of stuff bouncing around in the audience, so that's going to be fun to watch. Got a co-main event here that we're going to briefly talk about. Ali Quinta taking on Dan Hooker. The Hooker coming off a win over James Vick. Before that, took a brutal beating to Edson Barbosa. Ali Quinta was a guy who was right there on the cusp of top 5, top 2 or 3 in the division. Had a big opportunity against Donald Cerrone. Came up short in that decision. Before that, beat Kevin Lee. Before that, had the 24-hour notice fight against the champion Khabib Nurmagomedov, in which he went 5 rounds in. I like both these guys. I think that when I look at this fight, Hooker obviously got this fight, got this opportunity down there in Australia. He's a New Zealander, and Iaquinta, this is a good comeback fight for him. I think that he's a little bit more of a well-rounded fighter here, but Hooker's a very good kickboxer. What are your thoughts on this fight?
Yeah, it's a good fight. It's a nice little fight, and it's interesting. I think both guys have a lot on the line. I'm not sure it's a co-feature level fight. No disrespect to either guy, but this one, sitting in the co-feature spot where both guys are not in the title picture, so you kind of would look for a little more name recognition there. I favor Iaquinta in the fight, although I'm not. He's been consistent lately, and he's been fighting a lot lately. He took a couple of losses. The Nurmagomedov loss you can obviously, put as a feather in his cap. But the Cerrone fight was one where, Cerrone got a bump for his doorman type of status, and he firmly blocked Iaquinta from the top. And the bottom line is he didn't have a lot of good moments in that fight. So with that situation here, Hooker, I think Hooker's the right opponent for him to get off because Hooker's no Donald Cerrone. He'll bring what he brings and stuff like that. But Cerrone just had too many wrinkles in his game, and Iaquinta, thought he'd box him and stuff like that, and the Cerrone was completely ready.
I will say this about this fight. This is a gigantic opportunity for Dan Hooker. Not only is he going down into his home turf, but he's coming in ranked number 15 in the division, and Iaquinta's coming in ranked number 6. So this is kind of definitely a step backwards for Iaquinta, which is something that he needs after fighting Khabib and Kevin Lee and Donald Cerrone. He's had a murderer's row in his past 3 fights. So this is just an opportunity. Really, just it's definitely more on the safe side for Iaquinta where they're at in the division, but it's a huge opportunity right now for Dan Hooker to really move forward in this very hot division that we're going to talk a little bit more about later on with another fight that's been announced. But I agree with you. It's not really this is the whole card. I mean, we're not going to spend too much time talking about the rest of this card at all because it's really a one horse show. This pay-per-view will be sold on the back of Whitaker and Adesanya. I mean, that's the big one. And with everything that's coming up in November and December, the UFC's making up for it with the Madison Square Garden show and the Monster show in December at the UFC 245. But I agree with you. This could have also been a co-headliner on just an average fight night. This is a type of fight that I could see even a main event ahead of it on a fight night. But nevertheless, it's solid lightweight title fight. I mean, lightweight fight. They're both ranked. They both bring it. So I think this will be an interesting bout. The only other name I can really even bring up to mention that's on this card would be Tai Tuivasa, but he's not really – he's turned into more of like the bust category of the heavyweight division right now, but he's in his hometown – I mean, in his home country, and he's getting a fight on the main card of this card. We had Holly Holm set to rematch Raquel Pennington. That fell through. So, there's really not too much name value on this card, very little ranked opponents. So I think we're just going to move on from there and go on from here, Miguel, to we're going to cover just the main event for this weekend's Bellator 229 card. Andre Koreshkov taking on Lorenz Larkin. I do believe that the UFC, I've been saying it for a while, that the UFC welterweight division is the best division in the sport, especially when you look at – it used to be lightweight, but when you look at the amount of talent that's there at welterweight right now over in the UFC, you got Usman, Woodley, Covington, Masvidal, Leon, RDA, Nate Diaz, Ponzinibbio, Darren Till, Stephen Thompson, Maia, Askren, Pettis, Lawler, Vicente Luque, just this long list, Mike Perry, this long list of great talent. We go over to Bellator. I think that welterweight's the best division in Bellator also. You've got obviously the big welterweight title fight coming up between Rory McDonald and Douglas Lima. You got Michael Venom Page. You got Paul Daly. And you got other names like this. You got Andre Koreshkov and Lorenz Larkin. I think this is a very solid fight, solid main event. The undercard's pretty nameless. But you got any thoughts on this? Both these guys have been in there with the top talent in Bellator. But nevertheless, it's a pivotal fight for a division that's really stacked with some good talent, even over in Bellator.
I think it's a good fight. It's an enjoyable fight. I've been a Koreshkov fan for a while. Mm-hmm. I think he's one of the guys that, Bellator has done right by, and that they've kept him, active and in the rotation, even coming off of losses. They brought him back and things like that. And I think he's got a lot of potential. I think he's also already been a champion and things like that. So he's already fulfilled some of that potential, stuff like that. But I think he's a definite quality piece for a roster. Especially, that there are a couple of guys right now that are probably better than him there. That's what you want. And Lawrence Larkin, he's a UFC discard, but Larkin looks a lot like Ovin St. Pro or Jared Cannonier or like those mid-level guys that, with the right performance, the right day could make it a bad night for any of the top guys.
Yeah, I think you bringing up Koreshkov first. I like that because I think people really forget that this guy he had one loss prior to the Douglas Lima fights, and that was to Ben Askren. And that was back in 2013. So Koreshkov was still a young in the MMA game. He's 29 now. So back in 2013, he would have been about 23 years old. He's going against a very highly decorated wrestler who's one of the best specialists in the sport. We all know about Ben Askren. And he struggles in that fight, but goes on to go on a great win streak, picks up a win over Douglas Lima in their first fight, but then loses the second and third fight. He had that epic trilogy with Douglas Lima that was just great. If he would have won that trilogy fight, he would be in a completely different position than what he's in right now. He'd be a title contender. Those are his only 3 losses on his record. And he came back and had a win over Mike Jasper back in March. And now he's going against Lawrence Larkin, as you mentioned, came over from the UFC. And also I want to throw out about Koreshkov. He also has a win over Benson Henderson, former UFC lightweight champion. But Lawrence Larkin is another guy who came over to Bellator, and he lost to Lima and he lost to Paul Daly. But he's still a very talented fighter. I think this is a very pivotal fight. I'm going to call Koreshkov in this fight because I think that as I mentioned, the only 2 men that have ever beat this man is Lima and Askren. And he was a baby when he fought Askren. And Douglas Lima is, I think, a top 10 welterweight in the world. And I think he's going to beat Rory McDonald in their rematch. So I think that if Koreshkov can pull a few more wins together against high-level names, I think if he wins this fight, he's probably going to get matched up with Michael Venom Page. Is a very good possibility. Or Paul Daly. And if he gets the win there, we might see a 4th fight with Douglas Lima in the future. And if he wins that, then they even the score. We might see we might see a Jake LaMotta, Sugar Ray Robinson style thing going on with Koreshkov and Douglas Lima over in Bellator. So I don't think Koreshkov and his legacy over there in Bellator is out of the woods at all right now. He has been finished twice by Lima, but maybe he's learned from that. And he's got a big challenge this weekend. But if he can get through this fight and move forward, I think that he still has the potential to be a very, very solid top fighter in Bellator and a big name for Bellator. He's still not even 30 years old.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, Larkin is the fresher name, and Larkin Lima, Larkin Daly, Larkin against any of those guys. I don't know, maybe on paper is better than a rehash of Koreshkov. So Koreshkov should be careful and take this fight seriously and look to win it, because taking a loss here, he might find himself taking not a small step back.
Oh yeah, this will be the loser of this fight. I think, regardless, this is going to be a hurt for both of them and where they're at in Bellator moving forward. But going on to some news that came out last week, that we're still getting caught up, Miguel, on a lot of the news that we from last week's inactivity on our part, but we do need to cover this. Came out the Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic has been confirmed by Dana White that the trilogy is in the works, and that is what they want to go to. Pretty much overnight, as soon as that was announced and everybody heard about that, we started thinking, is it going to be December? Is it going to be January? When's it going to be? Pretty much overnight, we started getting the headlines that Stipe will not be expected to return until 2020 due to an eye injury that he sustained in the Daniel Cormier rematch, which he got poked in the eye in the first fight also. So I think this is something that definitely needs to be talked to Daniel Cormier about. We'll get a little bit about that, but Cormier's always had a problem kind of sticking his fingers out in people's eyes. And then, like I said, pretty much overnight, then Daniel Cormier goes on Ariel Helwani the next weekend and makes it very clear, passionately, that this will be his last fight. I, just like with the George St. Pierre retirement, don't always buy into everything a fighter says. I will say that right off the bat, that he wins this fight, especially if he gets a finish, and he caps off the trilogy with Stipe, there's still going to be pressure for a Jones fight. And I still think that that's possibly going to be there. It's going to be tempting for legacy. It's going to be tempting with the money. I still would not write that off. But we got the Trilogy fight, man. It's getting lined up, and I think that's I don't know about you, but I think it's completely appropriate. I think it definitely needs to happen. I would love to see DC make the Stipe made adjustments from the first fight. I'd like to see what DC is going to make adjustments going into the third fight. Mainly that he'll use his wrestling more, because he threw DC down in the first round. I mean, it looked like Jessica Andrade and Rose Namajunas level, and then never really went back to it. And he said in the post-fight press conference that his corner was just begging him to go back to his wrestling in that fight. And instead, he stood in front of Stipe. Stipe got his timing, started tearing up his body, and the fight was over. So, what are your thoughts on what will probably end up being the biggest Trilogy fight finale that we've ever had at heavyweight?
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I think it's definitely warranted. I think that, the first fight, the favorite won, but it was a flashy knockout. The second fight, the underdog there wasn't a wide disparity, but the underdog sort of came back and fought a terrific fight and broke him down and showed what you said, the adjustments that you want to see, including weathering the storm and things like that. So I think that next level of questions need to be answered. If Cormier comes in the same as last time, then he's going to lose, right? So I think it's very compelling. I think it's also nice that they went this way. And I think that Jones at this point, we're going to see Jones a little while at 205. Chris Weidman was in the news recently talking about potentially fighting Jones. And, you've got some of those huge middleweights we talked about, like, potentially Yoel Romero, Luke Rockhold, even though hopefully he retires with his glass head, but, like a Luke Rockhold level fighter without the problem of Luke Rockhold, like a Chris Weidman, for example. All of a sudden, that becomes interesting. Maybe Weidman at 185 is going to experience, a little bit of after effects from a weight cut and stuff like that. And then you've got, here a situation where maybe at 205 he's going to be, able to extend his career a little bit, and maybe get to the point where he wins a couple and can challenge Jones properly. I see those possibilities there for Jones, and staying at 205, and that way you just stay away from Cormier.
Let me ask you this question, since it does involve John Jones, and I already brought that up. Does John Jones? We look at light heavyweight. We know it's a thin division, but there is talent coming up. We got Johnny Walker, Alexander Rakic, who's a monster. Dominic Reyes, as you mentioned, is fighting Chris Weidman. If Dominic Reyes wins that, you're going to have an unbeaten top 5 contender who has never fought for the title. He's there. Does John Jones pursue a super fight before, or maybe even multiple super fights before he tries to go down that line of fighting these young up-and-coming talent? Johnny Walker is 6'4", very tall, very long, very big, heavy-handed striker. That could, in a very young, motivated athlete. The same with Alexander Rakic. The same with guys like Dominic Reyes, who are both young, tall. They have big frames, stuff that John Jones really hasn't faced with before. They're only going to be getting better. They're not really high on the name value compared to people like Stipe or DC or Brock Lesnar, who I still think is possible, that's a possible fight. Francis Ngannou or an Israel Adesanya. Do you think that John Jones and the UFC are going to try to pursue these massive super fights with John Jones while they can before they take the risk of these younger fighters coming up and potentially dethroning him and ruining all that?
I don't know. I think you're reaching for super fights. Not you in particular, but I think, the rhetoric around that super fight is there. I think the most logical super fight for John Jones right now is Cormier.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's already beaten him twice, he said, I've done it twice and blah, blah, blah. Cormier is really maybe the best shot there. Besides that,
what about Stipe if Stipe wins?
Besides that, you've got Ngannou, Stipe, him moving up to heavyweights. Those are fights where, now you have an open question as to how Jones is going to.
I think Miguel's froze up. Miguel will be back. We're talking about super fight potential between John Jones and who he would fight. Because this conversation gets brought up because Daniel Cormier is getting ready to rematch in the Trilogy fight with. There's Miguel back. Hold on. You're back.
Hey.
All right. But you froze up for a second, but we got on this conversation for anybody who, doesn't understand how we're talking about John Jones, about Daniel Cormier. If he wins this, he's saying he's going to retire, win or lose. This is his last fight with Stipe in the Trilogy. I'm saying hold off on that because if he wins this fight, I still think there's going to be a pressure to fight John Jones. But John Jones, he's looking at a division right now. I mean, who's he going to fight in the near future? I mean, is he going to rematch Anthony Smith, who he completely, dominated every round against? And I don't think really there's much fan appetite there. Jan Blachowicz, I mean, good fighter, but not much of a name. And he lost to who did Jan Blachowicz lose to? He lost to somebody just recently. So where do we go? I mean, unless Johnny Walker comes up, Johnny Walker is fighting Corey Anderson, who's like ranked number 6 in the division. If he goes in and just smashes him like he smashed everybody else, there might be really a big appetite for Johnny Walker, but that might be a little bit of a rush. Dominic Reyes is another top 5 guy who's fighting Chris Weidman, so he's about to fight a former champion. He might get it, but John Jones doesn't really have anybody that meets he's been around for a while. He's got the name value. The fight makes sense. He's up in the rankings. He's on a good streak. He doesn't really have that. That's why I'm theorizing, we've had this talks about Adesanya and Jones. We've had talks about Cormier and Jones. There's still rumblings about Brock Lesnar maybe coming in. I do think that the winner of this is you brought up, and I think you're correct, that Cormier is the one that makes the most sense. I would just go in a little bit further than that and say the winner of this fight makes most sense. I think that screws Ngannou, especially since Ngannou's already going to have to wait for this fight to happen. And then if Jones fights the winner, then we're probably looking at next summer. So Ngannou might have to wait another year before anybody. But that I think is going to be dependent on the UFC, because throwing Ngannou in there with any of this, it makes a big risk because that man can knock any of them out. I don't. But maybe your theory's right. Maybe John Jones is just going to stay put at 205 for a while now. Just because until there's just a clear dominant champion either at middleweight with Adesanya or Whitaker or somebody, or at heavyweight after that all clears out. What do you think?
Yeah, Jones is kind of, the DC man, it's going to be weird to make that fight materialize because they both kind of had this I don't want it, and I beat him twice, and there's been that sort of rhetoric around it. And I mean, the bottom line is Jones always going to be the A side. So Jones can fight any of these moderate names that we're talking about, or up and comers and stuff like that. And his paychecks are going to be there. And at 205, he's always going to walk into those fights against Johnny Walker or anybody else as a big favorite. Mm-hmm. So why not, just cash in your paydays for 3 more years in that weight class, really clean it out, including some of the new guys, and then move up to heavyweight. At that point, you've probably got rid of the DC stuff over your head. Miocic is older. Ngannou will probably still be a threat, and who knows what else you got up there. But that would be a good time for John Jones, and then he can really say, nobody did what I've done at light heavyweight. And that is sit there for a prolonged 5-year period of time, with respect to this, that, and the other thing, and really legitimately cleaned it out, not once but twice.
I was going to say, if you look, he won the title from Shogun back in 2011, and he's still, nobody's been able to really dethrone him except for himself and USADA. But moving on from here, we had another fight announcement that we'll briefly touch on. Gregor Gillespie fighting Kevin Lee, UFC 244 in Madison Square Garden on the undercard of the Masvidal-Diaz bout. We talked just briefly a little bit ago about Larkin and Koreshkov, about how that's just the loser there has a lot to lose. In this fight, when I see this, man, Kevin Lee can't get an easy night. He fights Tony Ferguson, gets put in there with Al Iaquinta in a fight that I think they expected him to win. After he beat, there was the Barbosa fight in between there that he smashed Barbosa, but then he gets put in there with Al Iaquinta and loses that bout, which was a hard setback. Tries to make a move up to welterweight that didn't turn out well. He fights RDA in his debut and gets beat there, submitted. Now he's going back down to 155 pounds. And he's getting put in there with a guy who many believe has the style, if he turns out to be as good as what they think he is, that could actually compete with Khabib because he's such a good wrestler. I mean, he's going in there against Gregor Gillespie, undefeated prospect. This is Kevin Lee. They've got him back in the lightweight rankings. They've got him ranked number 8. Gillespie coming in ranked number 11. I think this is a dangerous fight for Kevin Lee. The one thing I will say about Kevin Lee, though, that makes me happy is I have seen a difference in him in his interviews since he's moved to TriStar. He went up to TriStar in Montreal, started training with George St. Pierre and Faraz Zahabi and them, and he seems like he's more humble. He seems like he's more this is somebody who had no choice but to kind of reevaluate himself because he took so many losses and had to really kind of regroom and reassess of where he's at and what his potential is. And if he's around people that are able to sharpen the tools that he has, he might come back a much better fighter, but they must think they must definitely see something in him, because putting him against Gregor Gillespie on the kind of 1-3 streak that he's on right now, that's dangerous. I mean, you don't want him to go 1-4 in his last 5 if he loses his bout to Gillespie. So this is a dangerous fight for where Kevin Lee's at in his career.
Yeah, and I think judging all that for Gillespie, this is the right fight at the right time for him. You know, if on paper, he's a guy that he's gotten himself to rank 11, and he does have that buzz around his name, that specialist buzz of like that. You know, this guy's ground game is something that most guys aren't going to be able to handle. And so far, so good for him. But Kevin Lee is a step up in competition for him, and it's going to be interesting to see how he handles it. Now, if he handles it and he handles it relatively easily, yeah, Kevin Lee's in trouble, and Gillespie will probably be closing in on a fight with a top 5 guy, and I think that's right up their alley. If you listen to the rhetoric coming from that team, they think Gillespie's ready, so let's move. That's how they're feeling. So I think it just stands in the hourglass trying to read the chicken bones. It's a bad sign for Kevin Lee.
Yeah, when you look at like MMA like message boards or on these like fan pages like on Facebook and stuff, when you see like questions, random people like, oh, who can beat Khabib? Who's the best unknown lightweight? Man, the hardcore fans are all about Gregor Gillespie. They think that he's going to be the next big contender at this division, and that he's the guy that is a stylistic nightmare for all the top guys, that he can wrestle with Khabib, and that's going to cause problems with him, that he's good enough with his wrestling and his submission defense to really make problems for Tony, that he could do the exact same thing that Khabib did to Conor that he did. And I mean, if that's true, if he's really that elite of a competitor, then this is a very, very bad matchup for Kevin Lee right now. As I mentioned, when you're 1-3, I mean, in your last 4, even if they are losses to Al Iaquinta, Tony Ferguson, and Rafael dos Anjos, which are no chumps, obviously, I think management needs to be careful about who you're getting set up with. But, I like Kevin Lee. I'm actually a fan of Kevin Lee, but I think that he was a little bit overhyped. It's been proven. I'm glad that he's made a move. And, him going back down to 55 also, I think he's one of those guys. He's like I always call it the Kelvin Gastelum effect. Kelvin Gastelum is a guy who made welterweight sometimes. He's definitely not a big middleweight, but he would be perfect for a 175 division. Kevin Lee would be perfect for a 65 division. But Kevin Lee is a little bit too small. When you compare him against the Kamaru Usman to the world, he would be a small welterweight. But this cut to 55, that 15 pounds, for there being no division in between there, to me is just, it makes no sense. I've said it forever, and I was a guy who fought at 145 and 155 pounds back when I used to train there. I can only imagine if there was another 15-pound gap between 45 and 50, like if it was 160 and 145, or if I was fighting at 55 where I felt like I was small for a while, tried to make 45 and I had to make that other 5 pounds, there'd have been no way. I would have never. Making 45 was hard. So I don't think we need to have every 5 pounds a weight class. I mean, that'd muddy the waters too much. But I really think that 15-pound gap between 55 and 70 and 70 and 85, where there's the more talent than any other division, those are the three most stacked divisions. I don't understand why they couldn't make another weight class in there. I mean, me and you've talked about that forever, so we won't go into that. But Gillespie and Kevin Lee, UFC 244, big risk for Kevin Lee, and we're gonna find out something about Gillespie because Kevin Lee's now kind of a veteran and been in there with some top talent. But moving on from here, George St. Pierre on his Instagram posts this. And to me, this was a telling photo. This is one of those, Miguel, where they say a picture says 1,000 words or whatever. Just looking at him, and he captioned it, "Sushi tastes better even after a 75-hour water fast." So over 3 days of fast. Khabib Nurmagomedov gets on there and just simply says 155 ? You look at George St. Pierre there, and just over 2 years ago, he's on Joe Rogan, and a big segment of that podcast was him talking about intermittent fasting and how he's walking around much leaner than he's ever had, and that he feels better, he feels more energetic, he feels stronger, faster than he's ever had, and he's talked about going down. I've been saying it even when he had the retirement thing. George St. Pierre has repeatedly for years kept the door open for one last big super fight. He knows he does not need to go into a division, clear him out or nothing. He just needs certain fights. And here you have St. Pierre looking lean. I'm sure he's training hard. He looks confident, and he expects there to be a possibility that he gets that Khabib fight. And how brilliant would it be for him to go dominate welterweight for years, walk away at the right time at the first sign that he's starting to fade, go into obscurity a little bit, and then just pop up just to win the 185 title, vacant it, but he gets it on his resume. And then all he has to really do, Miguel, for his legacy is make 155 one time. One time, if it's against Khabib. If he makes it one time and beats Khabib, he can retire, and he'll have GOAT status stamped on him. I mean, that'll 3 division titles. He looks like a man that can possibly be pushing that down. He does not look like the same St. Pierre. He looks healthy. He looks trained. They both want this fight. There's money in that fight. I really do believe. I think that they are going to do the Tony fight, but it would not. Khabib's father's come out and said that he thinks 30-0 is enough. And everybody knows that Khabib listens to his father. He's 28-0. He's basically saying there's 2 fights left. I think he fights Tony, and then I think they push for the St. Pierre fight next summer.
Yeah, that makes the most sense. I mean, Khabib's done, the job to get himself into the super fight status. He's already banked a couple of paydays that, will put him into that super fight status and stuff like that. And I always talk about that effect on fighters. It's no matter what, and we're seeing it at a high level with McGregor, right? But no matter what, it's always hard to go back and do the same thing for less money. It's very simple, So here's a situation where I'm not surprised Nurmagomedov is thinking in terms of, legacy too, because a win over St. Pierre would definitely, I think the reverse is there. If Nurmagomedov were to win both of those fights and go out 30-0, we might be talking about the GOAT there.
For sure. Oh, for sure. I mean, that would be billed as the great. I mean, you got the BMF title going on the line with Masvidal and Diaz. If Khabib gets through Tony, especially if he goes in there and dominates him or even finishes him, which I don't think would happen, but I think that he will be the favorite going in there, and they get the St. Pierre fight set up, that will be sold as the GOAT fight. That will be sold as the fight of all fights. And I mean, obviously, we'll get to all that if the fight ever gets made and happened. I mean, there's going to be questions about St. Pierre down at 55, but I think these years have been formative. I think that he's taken years off for a purpose. I think originally it was the idea of Conor McGregor that would be the biggest super fight ever, and he talked about wanting to fight Conor. So I think he started seeing that's going to be the one big fight that I'm going to get. Conor's going to be a champion, a dominant champion, a huge name. I'm going to go try to make down there, and I'm going to come out of obscurity. They'll give me the fight, and I'll have to win one fight. Well, that didn't turn out that way. It turned out to be Khabib. And I think that that's where he's looking at is I'm going to get myself down to this weight. I'm going to be functional at this weight. I'm going to be used to this weight, and I'm going to go through trials to see if I can hit 55. And St. Pierre's got such a good mind around him, such a good team around him. He's the definition of a professional. It would not surprise me if this happens. And if he goes down to 55 and wins that, not only will I continue my call for him to write a book on how to manage a fight career, but he'll go out with a standing ovation, and that will be seriously historic for it to happen. But as you said, Khabib smashes him, and Khabib can ride out in the sunset with just a dominant resume as well. One last thing, Miguel, and we're going to talk about your favorite here. Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington is officially set to headline UFC 245. And the one thing I want to say about this, when we look at this UFC 245 pay-per-view, we have Diaz and Masvidal to thank for this, because with them being such hot prospects, able to headline Madison Square Garden without even a title fight on the card, that opened the door for something like this. We got 3 title fights at UFC 241, December 14th. And it's going to be headlined by Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington for the welterweight title, which is a great fight. Co-main event's going to be Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski for the featherweight title, which is another great fight. And then a rematch for the UFC women's bantamweight bout between the great Amanda Nunes taking on Jermaine Durandamy, which I think that's going to be a better fight than the first time. But they finally made it happen. Usman Covington, UFC 245. We're going to have so many more times to talk about this, Miguel, but what's your initial thoughts when you see this happen? It really wasn't much of a surprise, was it?
No, I mean, I like when guys think that they're going to negotiate with the UFC, right? Because it always turns into, all right, we'll wait or whatever, and then we come back and, it usually happens the way the UFC wants in the end run. Covington, whatever, he's on the radar, and he's been on the radar. He's not somebody who's going to give up, being in the spotlight and stuff like that. So this is his chance. I don't know. I can leave his persona and his whole hype stuff. I don't think it's appealing, and I don't think, it's good for the sport. The bottom line is that I think Usman and what he represents, again, as an African the descent and the hard work. And, the bottom line is he tooled Woodley. So he's the champ. And I think Usman hopefully wins this fight and we're done with this Covington mess. If not, I fear for what we're heading towards.
Do you think we're looking at like a little 4-man tournament right now with Masvidal and Diaz and Colby and Usman? Do you think that that's probably going to be the logical progression moving forward after this? I mean, obviously there's still guys like former champion Tyron Woodley and Leon Edwards, who's on a crazy streak that are probably a little bit more deserving of potentially fighting the winner of this. But money talks, obviously. So Masvidal Diaz, there's a big winner that comes out of that. A month later, we get a winner in this fight. Do you think that we're probably, let's say I think obviously if Masvidal and Covington both win, I think we're probably looking at a Masvidal, an ATT and home title fight between Covington and Masvidal. But what if it's Usman and Diaz? Do we see Usman go on to, look toward middleweight? Usman's looks so dominant in his UFC tenure right now. Or does he go on to trying to fight Leon Edwards, who he's already beat, or Tyron Woodley, who he's already beat? Or does he go for the money fight and try to fight Nate Diaz after that?
It's so hard to predict what Nate Diaz is going to do, The bottom line to me is Nate has his own, innate, for, pun intended, sense for the business, right? And he's done well by himself, so you can't say that, maybe he hasn't fought as much as I'd like to have seen him fight. I'd like to see him not take layoffs, and his brother, that goes, mixing suspensions, and that would be the only knock on it. I wish I'd seen them more, But they manage their career, they get their paydays. And the thing about Diaz that you got to credit is his paydays, like Masvidal sort of painted himself into a corner. I want a belt shot, that's the most money. I want, he needs the most money and stuff. So yeah, he wants to get paid. Diaz already gets paid. He doesn't even give a shit about the titles. I really honestly believe that. So yeah, I don't think he can look at Usman as a fight that's great for him.
God, no. God, no. So let's be honest.
Yeah, so I don't think Diaz is going to be in a rush to grab a belt. Masvidal, because of his rhetoric, sort of painted himself into a corner where he made the belt important, so people are going to expect him to want a title shot. So we'll see how it goes. I usually don't care, but I really would like to see Usman beat Covington. I think the continuation of the Covington bandwagon, it took a negative turn somewhere early. I haven't liked any of it really, and the guy's not smart in my book. Sorry, insulting, you know, beyond certain lines like he's done is something that I don't have to back him or anything like that. So yeah, I'm in the Usman camp for this one.
Yeah, I will say this, wondered how long. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Colby Covington, but I have wondered how much of that's an act because he's been caught off camera not seeming that way. I mean, and also that was one of Masvidal's big complaints in one of his most recent interviews is that I know who this man is, not on camera, and he's just taken his act way too far, and now he's ruining friendships over it, and he's an idiot basically up for it, and he's let money get to his head, and he's selling his soul basically for a persona that's not even really him. So I don't know about all that. I don't really want to talk about him, but you did just name probably the biggest understatement of the century that Usman would not be a good fight for Diaz. That's an understatement of the year right there. But I will say this a little bit. I want to talk about this because I think it blends in with the entire podcast. We talked a little bit earlier about a new UFC style Rumble in the Jungle. We have two UFC champions right now. Well, one's an interim champion technically, but after this weekend could be an undisputed champion with Nigerian heritage. Obviously, they're not going to try to make that move unless there's a perfect foe for a main event. But Adesanya definitely is probably the bigger star at the moment than Usman. But I think that there's a very big possibility that we could see something like in Nigeria with Adesanya, and if he has a really big foe, whether it's a Costa or a John Jones super fight or something like that, or maybe even these two fighting each other. If these two go on and get 2 or 3 title defenses and they're dominating people, could we potentially see Israel Adesanya and Kamaru Usman as a huge Rumble in the Jungle fight between two Nigerian, heritage-born fighters, or at least Adesanya main event, Usman co-main event, big African event headlined by these two Nigerian competitors? And I can't believe it's spacing me, but I know that that one guy that we previewed as a prospect of the week, he was Nigerian born, but there's somebody else that I'm forgetting that's also Nigerian, has Nigerian heritage in the UFC right now, and I feel bad for forgetting that. But what's your thoughts on that, about the real potential now of it making sense to go to Africa?
I mean, I think it always made sense to go to Africa. I think but the bottom line there is what are you going to do? You could go to South Africa, I guess, but that may come with a little bit of baggage and things like that. But at least you've got infrastructure in the country and stuff like that. Other than that, the UFC, what you have to understand about the UFC and their business model is that they're not going to do small shows. So it's not like they're going to plant seeds with UFC Africa and do fights in Luanda and Kampala and places like that. Now, why does Nigeria make sense? It's the second biggest economy behind South Africa in Africa. It's the biggest population, if I'm not mistaken, and it has a lot of potential. And they speak English. Now, it's not going to be easy to pull off a show there, but the UFC is going to be thinking big, and I think that Nigeria and their athletes, when they've made a splash on the big stage, I'm talking about, for example, their soccer teams and things like that, that they've crossed over and held up real well on the international level as stars and stuff like that. So I think the country has created stars like in soccer and things like that before, and I think it's time that if the UFC goes there, it's got to be something big. And I think you're outlining, you're connecting the dots. You know, two stars, two champions, either facing each other or in separate challenges. You know, that might be the way to go there.
Absolutely, and just for the record, it was Sodiq Youssef. He's I believe he's a featherweight. Yeah, he's an undefeated young 26-year-old prospect in the UFC right now. He's also Nigerian born. He came off the Contender Series. He's a very exciting fighter. But I remember there was multiple Nigerian competitors now in the UFC, and there's been articles about like the Nigerian takeover of the UFC and stuff. But I do think that those are the two names, and I think Nigeria is the spot. As you mentioned, I think it'd be hard to pull it off over there. I mean, I don't know what kind of venue. I know nothing about Nigeria, but I think if these two keep winning, I think that we're probably looking at them trying to make that happen. But at the same time, Max Holloway is a huge star in the UFC, has done more than pay his dues, and he's still getting fights in Las Vegas and in Canada and all this stuff, and he's been literally begging to go to Hawaii. So I don't know if it'd be easier to do a show in Hawaii or easier to do a show in Nigeria, but
I think I can answer. I think they'll make more money in Nigeria. I think maybe not the second or third time around, but for a one time bringing an international show to that economy, I think that it would react. I think it's a spectacle that the people would buy. I don't know that you turn the whole country into fight fans, but I think that they would watch that show.
What would be you know more about international, about the world than I do a little bit. What kind of security concerns would they have over there? And I mean, obviously if they can go to the UAE, I would think that they would be able to go to Nigeria, but
no, completely different ballgame. The UAE is basically they have a king, right? I mean, I think he's a prime minister or whatever they call it and stuff like that. But you're talking about they can lock their country down when they want. And you're also talking about a place that, for starters, is a very safe place. You know, they like to be able to host international events there and things like that. Now, are they susceptible to problems? And is there security there? And in the UAE, yes, but they're elite and they've become an international destination. None of that applies to anywhere in Nigeria. The UFC would be going into uncharted territory, and you're talking about a very dangerous country that, where they kidnapped 300 schoolgirls.
Mm-hmm.
That's Nigeria too. Now there's a divide between the north and the south, and there are major cities there in both places. But you've got 20 million people there and a major economy driven by oil and other things. They will find an audience that will monetize for them. And then doing that security, the security bill is going to be higher there than in any other place. I mean, the bottom line is Nigerians also have oil in the southern part of the country, and they kidnap oil workers and things like that. Those are very real concerns that they don't face, when they're doing a show in Vegas. But and maybe that it's not the right time, social and economically, for the country, but we're getting close. We're getting close to that point. And I point to the soccer team as a crossover stars and stuff like that. And I think the country's ready.
I don't want to make this. We've been on here over an hour already, so I don't really want to make a political conversation about this. But why? What is the reason for that? Like I used to be, Miguel, very libertarian in my thinking, and what's really changed a lot of that, as I've brought up here before in some of our conversations, is understanding just how much law and order and military and that is so important to the. I mean, I wouldn't even. That's an understatement right there. It's absolutely vital, probably the most vital to a functioning society. You can't have the kind of structure that you need to have a functioning society without good law and order. What is stopping some of these developed and prosperous nations in areas like you said in Nigeria and stuff from having what's still continuing their security issues? Is it cultural?
How people adapt to things. Obviously, the culture is going to have certain effects on them. I think in Nigeria in particular, and I'm not an expert in any case, but in Nigeria in particular, you're talking about a huge population. You're talking about a population that once you get into tribal roots, is extremely varied, extremely varied. Now, managing all that and trusting people across those divides seems to be a challenge. If you're from one tribe, you don't work with the other, and maybe at some point there's been violence in the history and things like that. A lot of that stuff rears its ugly head. The Muslims operate in the north. The southern part is considered Christian animist. I think it would be in the southern part that they would do the show if you could do it. But I'm not saying that they may not be able to do it. It's that level of dangerous in the country. But what I feel is when an international name like the UFC, a real brand, comes in featuring Nigerians is going to give them treatment, I think that the country also reacts in a Nigerian-centric sort of way. It's like, heck yeah, they'd like to see the show. They'd like to see Nigerians pushed on a world level and making their money and stuff like that. I think that the first show there could be monetized. But, you're talking about countries that were dominated and only last century got their independence from Europe, And a lot of the problems that they have are, because the European system, to me, wasn't preparing those places to become their own independent countries. It was there to dominate, and then they sort of backed off and let go, and they just didn't have the preparation, to get everything going on all cylinders. So,
see, we do need to have a conversation about this because you brought up European colonialism. Obviously, the big fear with the Western powers in their mind, it seems, as you mentioned, they were more about colonizing it and dominating it, and making sure that it was under their thumb, so they knew what was going on over there. Same thing that the U.S. and the Western powers are doing in the Middle East, where they don't really want to build them up on their own and let go. They want to be there. They want to exact their power over them. Is that why? Obviously, the only way to actually enact that is to make it permanent. So, it can't be a short-term thing. But is that a wise strategy to do, long-term colonialism in order to make sure that it doesn't go rogue and become, to where we have problems down the line, to where now we have an adversary. We built up our own adversary and we let go. Then they turned against us and sided with our enemies. So, there's so many of these geopolitical maneuverings that would have to be pretty complex, I would think, on a international stage where, okay, do we build up this sovereign state, let them go, and then potentially have all the time and money and go to waste because they become adversarial and we no longer have any sort of influence over them? Or do we stay perpetually involved and occupy it perpetually? But then that doesn't seem like it'd be economically affordable. That's a tough conversation that we need to have sometime on here about geopolitics and how do you manage these countries how does the developed world manage the undeveloped world properly? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, if you're treating people with respect, I think that's the issue from the very beginning, that you don't treat people with respect. If you show up in Africa and you're nurturing them and you're treating them like Europeans, right? You come in and you nurture them a little while, you give them votes, and you start helping with houses and toilets and some of those types of things. I think everybody would be on our side. You wouldn't have any adversaries. But if you go in there with an attitude of let's rape and let's grab the men and ship them to America for cash, and I don't think we behaved ourselves in such a light that we were impressive, right?
So you're talking further back than what I was talking about, just like in the mid 20th century, where
even then, with in that area, you've got the Congo and Belgium and stuff like that. I think in general, the reputation is that the whites were there to take advantage and rape the land and not really nurture it, And you see some reactionary, things like, for example, in Zimbabwe, South Africa even, but Zimbabwe, Mozambique, those countries that had a lot of white farmers. And the white farms, lo and behold, they ran well, right? And the countries actually had a reaction, especially in Zimbabwe, where they just said to the white farmers, they said, you know what, that's our land, for generations before that, we're taking it back. They gave it to black farmers who weren't capable of administering the business the same way. Whose fault is that? if they never taught the locals, if they kept everything for themselves and stuff like that. So it's an extremely delicate situation. What the locals found themselves doing is watching the white farmers take all the riches of their land for themselves. They all live well, and the divide, that's the bottom line divide in Nigeria or anything else, so that we can wrap up the conversation, is the divide between the rich and poor is always going to be a bugaboo, and that is startlingly huge in Nigeria right now. So the UFC would have to face that down if they're going to do a show there. But I think if you're talking about where the elite is in Nigeria, you're talking about, yes, the elite of that country, I think, would buy a big show and it would monetize on a world level, and I think their economy is there. So the UFC's got a decision to make.
Real quick, because I'm kind of fascinated by this conversation right now. We hear a lot about this, okay. You talked a little bit about the tribalism that's already in Africa, just among, that's divided among more cultural lines. I mean, by people that look just like them. Europeans come in, they treat the white farmer better than they do the black farmer. And they, obviously we know about the transatlantic slave trade and how they devalue. We had a constitution over here in the United States that said that all men were created equally. So they had to devalue them and say that they weren't really even a man. They weren't even really human. They were like a subspecies. We know that went on. Do you think that was inherent to, can we attribute that to power and European culture and whiteness and all that? Or can we just attribute that to any culture that would have been advanced at that time, that would have been going over into other cultures and wielding its power would have been the same way toward any that it's more of a power and just the ignorance of the time, that these people they weren't well informed about different people that didn't look like them and weren't like them and didn't come from where they came, and that there was this tribalistic aspect that guided their thinking, that we are superior. They looked at them like barbarians and less than human. Would that have been any different? Do we contribute that to a certain race or certain culture, or do we just attribute that to I'm powerful and you're not?
I was watching a documentary on China and how China views North Korea.
Yeah.
And if you watch, to a man, every Chinese person will say, we're better than them. So I think I think anybody who's more advanced, i.e. better in, whatever glasses you want to use to judge it, right? But when you're in first place, the reaction is to try to stay that way, and I think it becomes ugly. So I think it could be susceptible. It just happened to be the whites that got there and behaved as ugly as anybody could ever behave, But I don't know that isn't a core human thing, where if it had been the other way around, that they would just turn it in. In fact, I'm pretty sure in history, the guys in first place have always been dominant and abusive and not good people. When they, very little olive branches have been extended and say, hey, let's build houses for all the people we just conquered. That doesn't sound like rhetoric from history that I know of. So I think that's what it comes from. And it happened to be the whites. So we have a situation where, it turns into the modern era of racism and things like that, and it has roots way back then. And it's very complicated. So, but I think once again, just to wrap it up, bring it back to what we're talking about. I think sport is an answer to racism.
Yep.
I think doing big events in places like this, asking Nigeria to step up. It's like, look, Nigeria, we're the UFC. We go to Japan, Australia, England, Germany. We do shows all over the United States. We do wherever we want. Brazil. How would you like to be on that list of countries? You know what I mean? And I think that they would want to step up and for the pride of country, because I think Nigerians will have a pride of country. So it's a weird situation when we're talking about race and things like that, because, sport hopefully transcends all that.
The reason I wanted to foster into this conversation a little bit, wrapping up here, is just because that is the kind of healthy dialogue that this country needs right there, Miguel, on the subject of race and racial history. That we're not excusing the things of the past, but we're bringing things into context. We're bringing analysis of where they were, who they were, and would the shoes have been any different flip-flop and what's really the mentality that goes into them instead of just attributing a certain racist inherency to one specific culture or person or identity, which I believe is racist.
Number one.
Yeah, and it doesn't help anything. I think the most clear what you just defined that I think sums it all up is there's a superiority complex in all people, and we tend to feel like we're better. And if we're a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit, and we see that with wealth, we see that with prestige, with what position people are in, they tend to get the superiority complex. And a lot of times when people get that kind of arrogant, egotistical, they get humbled in the future. But, that would be, so I do agree with you that something like this would be something to break those barriers. And I think sports has had a very big impact on that. And I would love to see a modern manifestation of the great Rumble in the Jungle that once happened. And I would love to see it be the UFC that brings that there. With that, we're going to sign off. We covered a lot of this. Was a great podcast. We have a lot to look forward to this weekend. Let's try to make this weekend in live time right afterwards, because I want to get that on Facebook initially. Maybe Chad, maybe Amanda, maybe somebody would want to join us. Let's try to have like an instant reaction to Adesanya Whitaker this weekend, because I think it's a very big fight, and I want to beat the other podcast out to get our content out.
Check local listings for start times. Don't get messed up, because it's Sunday local time, Saturday night for our time, or maybe a little bit earlier or whatever. So definitely worth looking, and give us a visit at the CRP. We talked about a little non-fight subject, so I just want to plug a little bit of a different type of podcast I'm doing. I'm doing a book review of the Gulag Archipelago.
Oh, really?
On a few international subjects. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you can be on the lookout for it. It should be the first part of the review should be up sometime in the next 24 to 48 hours. So, of course, hit like, subscribe. Great job by Devin, as always, guiding the MMA stuff here on the CRP. And there's a slew of videos there. Any love you can give us, we appreciate. Thank you very much.
Talk to you next time.